Hello, music lovers. Chris Vaneman here, Dean of the School of the Arts at Converse University. And with me once again is my friend Young Shik Concklin, Music Director of the Spartanburg Philharmonic. And we're going to be talking about the program that is coming up on April 20th at 7 p.m. in Twitchell Auditorium. So John, thanks so much for coming and joining. I suppose, is there anything you should be thanking me because we're on stage here today?
That's right.
And I was the one who came to
work here, yes.
Right,
and
right.
This is always beautiful being on this stage. It's such a wonderful place.
Yeah. So tell us about this program. What are we going to hear?
We have three really wonderful pieces. The centerpiece of the concert is the Shostakovich Fifth Symphony, which is probably one of his most famous pieces. But we're pairing that with a piece by Duke Ellington that he wrote for orchestra, or that he sketched for orchestra and his brother finished, Three Black Kings. And then we're starting the concert with a piece by an Atlanta-based composer who's still living, his name is Joel Thompson, and it's called An Act of Resistance.
And it's a really interesting combination of pieces. And in a few minutes, we'll get to how you arrived at that particular combination of pieces. But let's talk first about the Shostakovich, if we could.
Yeah, sure. So the Shostakovich is, it's a massive piece, and the reason that, there are two reasons why it's famous. The first is that it's just so well crafted, but the other reason is that there is just this monumental story and mystery around the piece. What did he mean by this? And so the context of it is that after a couple of unsuccessful pieces in the eyes of the Russian government, they essentially told him, this next symphony of yours, it better be good or you're going to the gulag, or possibly worse. And so the pressure of writing under those circumstances, and then what he came out with, when it was premiered, as if we were to believe the recounts, the audience sort of brought the house down, and the government sort of was forced to just sort of put him back into their good graces. But he always sort of lived under this tenuous knife edge of an existence, as most Russians did at that time with their government. And so to be able to create a beautiful piece of art under those circumstances, for it to be successful, and then for it to continue on and live outside of the USSR, now this is 70 years later, is pretty wonderful. And just audiences seem to identify with it. They love it, regardless of which story they sort of go with.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking now about the Soviet Union in the mid-late 30s, right?
That's right.
So we've got Stalin is in power, and Stalin's been in power long enough that he's kind of consolidating things. And he wants to be in control of not just the politics, but even the culture.
That's right. Yes.
Right?
Yes. I mean, the censors, and if you just sort of stepped outside or made anything critical of the government, you could really face critical punishment for anything that the government didn't like. And you can imagine how scary it would be to live as an artist in that place, because you're constantly working under very strict parameters. They really wanted music that sort of made idols out of Russian culture, out of the current status, sort of lifting up the way of life of the government there at the time. And Shostakovich was known to he has a streak of doing the opposite of what you ask him to do.
Yeah, he's kind of like innately a little bit of a smart aleck, right?
Yeah, I mean,
at least he was as a young man, I think.
His first symphony was so wildly outside of the bounds that, I think they basically put him on a blacklist from the beginning, because he was sort of into realism and things that did not square with the picture that the Russian government wanted him to portray, I guess is the thing. And so he was always sort of riding that edge. He was growing as a composer, but then he got into some trouble with some opera, and his Fourth Symphony was not very well received. And so they told him, this Fifth Symphony better be good, or else.
So he's gotten himself into this situation where he's got to produce something that is a hit with the audience,
Yep.
and that manages to deflect the official censors.
Right.
And so tell us about the piece that he produces here.
So it's actually helpful to understand it from now, the modern day era. There is a current theory that goes that he sort of wrote a piece that was rebelling against that, sort of saying, if you want this, here it is, but I'm going to embed all of these sort of anti-USSR things in it. And that is based off of maybe three things. The first is that there is a biography that was written about Shostakovich after the fact, that identified that he had sort of anti-Soviet tendencies, but I think a lot of people did. They just didn't say that out loud.
Right.
So that is a little revisionist in the sense that we can't tell how much of that actually manifested, right? So that lens sort of puts that into context. The second is just because of the geopolitics of it, of the Cold War, there is this especially American notion of kind of wanting to continue to win the Cold War, I guess, and so that also fits with the American sort of view of things. And then the third actually is Leonard Bernstein. He was performing it in the Soviet Union, I think, and there's this strange marking at the end of the fourth movement, which drastically changes the interpretation. And he says to Shostakovich, who's live, he's right there, he says, if you do it faster, it sounds victorious. And Shostakovich, unfortunately, said, I love it. But I could imagine if Leonard Bernstein asks you for something and enthusiastically tells you something, I would say yes too, even if that was not my intention, right?
We all saw that movie a couple months ago. Yeah.
Even Bradley Cooper could get me to say yes, so imagine Leonard Bernstein, right? And so then what happens now is that there is this second version of the piece that is authorized by the composer. He said it, I love it, that drastically alters the piece. And so then all of the other two things neatly fall into place into that narrative. The issue is that if you go back, if you remove the Leonard Bernstein issue and make the politics sort of suspect and put him into the place of actually writing it and then see what he wrote, it doesn't necessarily square. It works. That interpretation of sort of the first movement is something, the second movement is a military sort of irony, sarcastic thing, the third movement is a lament, and the fourth movement is a victory. That works, but it doesn't really square with what he wrote for the fourth movement. So then, as a conductor, we have to sort of solve this riddle. What path are we going to choose? Do you take the one that we know works but may not necessarily be the most complete? Do you take the one that's complete but is much more difficult and more complex and may not have Shostakovich's necessarily affirmation because he wasn't able to affirm these things? And so I have spent a lot of time just sort of thinking about this piece. I spent Christmas break just sort of walking around wondering what the piece was about, and have sort of come to the conclusion that it's not a victory. In fact, it's something completely different. There is a victory in it, but there is also the light and dark both exist at the same time. And that's why I think the Russian people, when they heard it, they immediately identified with it, because you have the oppressive forces under which you live, but you also have the beauty of life. So you have your kids, you have your spouse, you have the sunlight, at the same time as you have this imminent gulag threat at all times, right? And so I think he actually wrote that. I think he wrote this grief of living his normal life, parts of which he loved, but there's just this looming thing. And so when we get to the end of it, it's both at once. It's I am happy that I am alive and I have these things, but there's this other thing that just still always exists. And so you kind of start and end in the same place. And so it's a remarkable journey we go over. But then all of the other movements begin to make sense at that point, in that context. The third movement is definitely a lament. The second movement is maybe not sarcasm, but it is an observation of the machinery, of the coldness of the Soviet sort of regime and the way that they govern. And the first movement, in the version that's a victorious version, I could never square what the first movement meant. I could buy, in the victorious sort of framing, the second movement as a military sarcasm, third movement. I could never square what the first movement meant. But if we take it as grief, can you imagine Shostakovich in his apartment at night? And at night is when they would come for you, right? So we start with this very odd introduction that does not follow a typical form. So already he's trying to say something to us because we don't have a typical first movement. So he needed something else. And there are two ideas that are persistent throughout the entire symphony. The first one is ba-ba, ba-ba, this dotted rhythm, which I interpret as it's time moving forward. So you just can't stop it. Anytime he needs to move time forward, there's just this ba-ba, ba-ba, ba-ba. It keeps on marching. And then there is the second idea, which is bam, 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 which is the Soviet just sort of looming presence. And it sometimes it's benign, ba, 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 ba. We sort of get a beautiful melody on top of it, but it's always there. It's at the climax of the first movement, in a very terror-filled moment. And it's actually at the end of the symphony too. It's just in D major. So we think that it's happy, but it's actually still there. On top of ba 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 ba. It's the last thing we hear is bum 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 bum, that sort of time moving forward thing. So you start and you end in the same place. You just go on this remarkable journey. So the first movement for me, because the paddy wagon comes for you at night, you could imagine the sun going down. Shostakovich is getting more and more anxious because tonight might be his night. But he still puts his kids to bed. He sort of kisses his wife goodnight, puts her to bed, and he's just sitting, watching out the window, waiting and waiting. And you can feel the tension building, and you can hear the people coming. You can hear the van coming, and he gets more and more anxious. We get this wild climax, and then he realizes that they're not coming for him. It's not his night. And so there is this strange ending of the first movement where it sounds like everyone's going to sleep, and it's because they are, it's because he survived the night and he can finally go to sleep because the sun has come up. There's this beautiful sunrise moment just before that as well. So all of a sudden then it made sense to me of he's just telling us his story, and it's amazing because there's no program, but he didn't write any program down, but if you put yourself in his experience, then this stuff begins to make sense. And then it becomes even perhaps more nuanced and meaningful than just sort of victory over an oppressive thing, right? There's something really special that he was able to capture in music that is complex, and they have opposite feelings at the same time. I mean, that's really hard to do, and exists there. And so as a conductor, I have to find a way to get the orchestra to play both joyfully and sort of resigned to nihilism at the same time, right? It's possible. We all sort of have to be on the same page and have to listen for it, but so it actually has sort of nothing to do with this. It sort of has to do with maybe talking about the piece a little bit, knowing that it's there, sort of believing it into existence kind of thing. And it's a wonderful challenge. Yeah, it's exhausting. I'm sort of starting to get in shape for it. Yeah.
And Shostakovich is an especially interesting challenge to a conductor, I would expect, because he himself was so silent about saying, oh, my music means this piece means that. Yeah. You have only the tones and no words to go by. So you're looking at the tones, you're using your understanding of what his life was like, and then you're using your knowledge of music, to understand that, oh, this chord, this gesture tends to be associated with this experience or with this set of emotions, and then you're using imaginative empathy to construct kind of a story and a read for the piece, right?
Yeah, I've never thought of it as imaginative empathy, but that's absolutely right. I mean, the clues that we do know is that he wrote a bunch of symphonies, and so he is a symphonist. And the core idea of a symphony is that there is a core idea, or maybe two core ideas that are related, and we build an entire piece of work off of two musical ideas. Now, they might represent something else. Beethoven made hints at his motives meaning something else, right? So it's not foreign. Shostakovich does reference Beethoven when he's writing the symphony, and so, you know, they have a kinship of a way of approaching symphonies. And so I don't think it's too far outside of the box that he might have assigned a musical gesture to an idea outside of the musical world. And he is, yes, notoriously silent. I think there's stories of people playing his music for him, and he just sort of nods and says thank you. And then, next person, it's not impolite, but it's also enigmatic. Yeah.
So then to move backwards, as we work our way back through the program, the Shostakovich was the piece that was first established as this is going to be the centerpiece of the April program. And then when you selected the two pieces that went with it, tell us about the things that you were thinking about as you selected those pieces.
Sure. So when we settled on Shostakovich, I realized that I was going to need to bring something on the lighter side because of the way that I approached the piece. And so Shostakovich was also really interested in jazz. He was not celebrated for that at the time, but he was definitely interested in jazz. And we also have a really big orchestra on stage, and there is this piece by Duke Ellington that I've always loved, and it doesn't get played a lot for whatever reason. I'm not sure why, but it's just a wonderfully light and beautiful piece that you can't just help but feel good after you listen to it. It's fun to play. There's a saxophone solo sort of in the third movement that comes as a nice surprise. And it's just such a lovely triptych that he wrote as he was sort of transitioning his musical journey. Because he started writing for orchestras, which I wish he had more time to do that, because I can imagine what we would have received as a result.
Yeah, so Ellington, band leader, songwriter, almost a direct contemporary of Shostakovich, in fact, right?
Yeah,
I mean, their dates almost line up. Their careers developed along the same time. They died very close to one another. And becomes really well known as a band leader and songwriter in the popular music genre, and it's not until the 1940s, when he was well established as a songwriter, right, and a band leader, that he even began to write for the orchestra. And then this piece comes much later.
Yes, so he sort of sketched it out, and on his deathbed sort of authorized his brother to finish it. And there are a couple of different arrangements of it. The core music is the same across all of them. We're doing the one with the saxophone soloist. Because we have wonderful talent here in Spartanburg, Tom Wright, who's going to be joining us on stage. Fantastic. I shared the stage with him Valentine's Day 2014, I think. That just date sticks out for whatever reason. I just remember that concert. But there's just an interesting camaraderie that the two composers have together. Shostakovich, obviously in an oppressive environment in the Soviet Union. Duke Ellington, in a different way, but equally oppressive. Of course, he was living during Jim Crow, and you could imagine the thought of him wanting to write for orchestra. I'm sure there were people who resisted that temptation, that idea, right? But he has such a unique voice, and we should celebrate unique voices, because that's how you get really good things, right? And so this piece just exists out there. I've always wanted to get it on stage. They just really went well together because Shostakovich is about light and dark.
Mm-hmm.
Duke Ellington is also about light and dark. It's just in sort of a different frame, right?
Yeah.
But they really go together, and there is something for me about the MLK movement that really captures the love that he called for, like the empathy that he called for, right? Which is something that Shostakovich was also sort of desperately wanting, right?
Right.
And
the light and dark aspect that you referenced here, so the final movement of this piece is on the one hand a lament at the murder of his good friend, Dr. King, and on the other hand, it's this joyful celebration at the same time, and this sort of gospel-inflected singing kind of quality to it. So it also has a kind of light and dark thing going at the same time, does it not?
It's almost like you're at a wake, because there is a mourning happening, but also smiling through tears kind of thing. That it's just fantastic. You feel light, you feel lifted afterwards. At least I usually do. And so I just thought that was a perfect way to pair the two together. In fact, we've struggled figuring out which one to go on which half. I think we'll end with Shostakovich, just because it's a huge ending. But we'll end the first half with the Duke.
And it's interesting to me to note that both of these pieces have this kind of ambivalent, ambiguous quality about them, where the listeners will come away knowing that they're feeling something very strongly, but you won't necessarily be able to put your finger in words on exactly what it is you're feeling, which is really what music is for, right? That it allows us to explore emotions and experience emotions that don't necessarily have a specific little box or a word attached to them.
Yeah, that's definitely the goal for the concert. If we can get people walking out sort of thinking about, like, well, how do I feel right now? Like, I feel two things at once. That would be an immense success. What do I think about this piece? What is the meaning of this piece? That's fantastic.
And frankly, if we could translate the meaning of a piece into a little 30-second encapsulation in a video, why would anybody bother coming to the concert and spending the money on the ticket?
That's right. You have to go through the emotional journey of it. It's easy to put on something sad. It's easy to put on something happy. To do something both at the same time, that's what we're really after here. And so this concert I'm really looking forward to, because we get to really go into some really complex artistic things with the orchestra that sometimes we don't get to explore. Sometimes we're playing just really joyful music, and that's great, or just we're playing Bohème and she dies every time, and it's just sad every time, 100% of the time. It's sad, right? But this one, it'll be a challenge for me. It'll be a challenge for the orchestra, and I'm just looking forward to it.
And speaking of ambiguity and open-endedness, let's talk for a little bit about the Joel Thompson piece. Can you tell us what we can expect?
Sure.
Or maybe what we can't expect?
Well, there's a little bit of that too. I've known Joel's music since about 2019. He's an Atlanta-based composer, and he's primarily a vocal composer. But he's started getting into the orchestral world. And the piece is called An Act of Resistance, and it is not nearly as, it is not a protest piece in any way, shape, or form.
So I'm going to state that right out of the bat. There. Don't worry, folks. You haven't heard of the composer.
If you're taking Shostakovich as an act of protest, right? So none of these are acts of protest. These are the title makes sense when you read about what he intends. He's a person that looks at our world and is sort of heartbroken at how dehumanizing we all are towards one another, in terms of if we have a disagreement. And the first thing to do is just dehumanize the other person, and then you can say anything you want to about them and not feel bad. He's just sort of aghast at the idea of that. And so he has written a piece that describes that in music, and it is cacophonous. It's a short portion of it, but it is uncomfortable to listen to, not because it's ugly music, but you can just sort of sense that the disharmony exists. And there's something, because we're all human, that we kind of don't want that. And so there is a brief moment of discomfort. But also, there is just a gorgeous, harmonious section that is even more harmonious because, in contrast to the disharmony. But the most critical part actually comes at the end. And I've talked to him, and we're going to expand this a little bit. But he outlines 4 different, very small melodies, and we'll present them to the audience beforehand and sort of explain all of this. But the music winds down, and we get to a very intimate moment with the violas, just holding a note. And the instruction is, for anybody who would like to, you can start singing these lines, and it becomes a harmonious sort of chorus, if you will. And we're going to extend this to the audience. And the question that he poses, essentially, is who amongst us will offer empathy to the other in the form of song? And there's not a lot more you can do more harmonious with somebody, a stranger, than singing with them, right? There's actually studies that show when people sing together, or when they're in the presence of music, the heartbeats start to all beat together, right? So I think he's after this. And so because he's asked the question of us all, it's a fantastic piece to think about, because one, if no one sings, it's fine, but it just shows us where we are. We're just not ready for this moment yet. That's fine, but it is something to think about, right? If I am not willing to just hum a single note, with the proposed question of, can you just provide some empathy by singing this note? Yeah, maybe that says something, right? If a few of us sing, great. That's also an indication of where we might be headed. But the real gold is if we're all moved by the question and we have 2,000 people singing this quick tune with one another. And he leaves it, he just says, just sort of let the spirit move you, and I'll sort of come to the end of the piece, the violas will hold the note, we'll wait a little bit. If people start singing, we'll let it go until it stops. If people don't, we'll just cut it off, and that'll be that. But it's just sort of I thought it was a wonderful sort of pairing, because all the composers are seeking empathy, and this is sort of a direct call. This isn't something that you sort of leave the whole thinking about, like, what does the composer mean? He's telling you what he's asking for. And it's a nice way of, I think, bringing the audience into the experience of the art creation, but just also the shared experience that art can provide to us by highlighting the humanity that we all have with one another.
And to call people's attention to something that might pass unobserved, it also really flips the relationship between conductor and orchestra, or even conductor and audience, does it not? I mean, we have those of us as, old heads like myself who grew up in the 20th century.
Old heads.
And got to know conductors as kind of dictator figures. Whether or not you're a musician, whether you grew up watching Bugs Bunny pretending to be Leopold, and how terrified the orchestra members and the tenor soloist were of Leopold, the dictator of the orchestra. And here is something where the conductor, at the most crucial moment, perhaps, the moment of now it's time to end the piece, everybody, is handing over control to literally everybody else in the hall, by the sounds of things. So you could have stagehands, it's like continuing to sing, and you can't end the piece because the stagehands won't shut up.
We've talked about this. I will pose it to I'll pose it to the orchestra. I'll tell them what we're doing. I've talked to the staff about it, but we will say that if you do not feel forced. In fact, Joel said that to me, because I was saying, can we do this with the audience too? And he said, yes, but it has to be a choice. That is the whole point of it. And I love how it does.
And you cannot offer the audience doubler's fees or anything like that for singing. They've got to do it for free, right?
I can teach you what the lines are, but you have to sing it. Like, I'm not going to turn around. I'm just going to put my arms down, and that's it. And I think it's just so wonderful, the decentralization, because people in power who have abused it are possibly why we're in this situation, because in order to stay in power, they have to divide people in order to stay in power, right? There's really something about that. Their conductors are the worst. There used to be a time in which they controlled everything, and that springs from Wagner, actually, which in the hands of, maybe I can count them on my hand, like 3 or 4 people, I'm willing to accept the dictatorial nature because they're actually that brilliant. But for everybody else, it's a team sport, and I think we should absolutely lean into that, and we're getting into that. The job has changed. Whether or not people are changing with it is a whole other story, but all you have up there is influence. You have no power. Once the music starts going, you have absolutely no power. You can only shape and you can only influence what's happening. And if you lose that, then you're just art adjacent. You're not actually participating in it, and there's no worse feeling than standing on stage for 2 hours knowing that people are ignoring you and to just get through it, right? But the piece will come with a little bit of a setup because it needs to be explained, and that'll be my job at the beginning of the concert, to sort of set the thing up, pose the question on behalf of Joel, and then we'll just see what happens. It's a beautiful mystery, actually, that I'm excited for. And the other thing is, I thought it might have been a risk, but then I realized there's actually just no risk in it at all, because if no one sings, that's fine. That just says where we are. And that's okay. It's good to reflect and just look at yourself in the mirror every once in a while, and maybe we can do it in a few more years and see if something's changed, right? Also a good tool. So. Yeah.
Plus, you can just blame them if they don't like it. You know?
Yeah.
Well, you guys didn't sing enough. It's your fault, obviously. So, but as I'm hearing you talk about this, it sounds as though this will be the first performance where the audience is given the opportunity to take part, right? Because the score actually guides the orchestra, or suggests that the orchestra be the ones to do that work, correct?
That's right. I saw it. Joel only asked the orchestra to do it, but because of the concert, because I know our audience likes to participate, and it feels really intimate in here, I sent him a quick note and saying, look, I have this idea, can we just pose it to the audience? Would you mind? And he said he liked the idea. It just has to be a choice. You can't force anybody to sing, you can't have any plants. It just has to be of the moment. If the spirit moves you, which I love about that. And there's something at stake for everybody in the room at that point. And so I think there's a movement now, I don't necessarily think it's a movement, but people are heading in this direction of viewing the audience as part of the performance. We learned this after COVID. When you perform in community hall, it's different, right? The audience is part of it. This is not a museum. If we treat this like a museum, AI and the robots will take over and you don't need us, right? Nothing wrong with museums. I love museums. I go to museums. But this is living, this is alive, right? It requires alive human beings to produce. And so because there are also live human beings in the audience, we have to view them as part of this process. It's the heartbeat thing. When we're all in the same room, sharing the same space, sharing the same music, sort of start to act as one organism or feel as one organism. That alone tells me that we have to involve actively and inactively sometimes. And so this is, yes, a tip of the cap in that direction.
And that does mean that audience members will be participating in something historic insofar as I've certainly never heard of a piece with this kind of setup where the conclusion of the piece is left to somebody other than the conductor even, and now to open that opportunity to the audience and say, hey, audience, y'all are going to be the one to figure out how this thing ends.
Yes.
That's actually really fascinating.
I mean, this is kind of the reason that I do what I do, and it's because orchestras are possibly, or musical ensembles are possibly the last place on earth in which people try to help one another just for no reason at all. So, in other words, I know, not on our stage, but in other orchestras, there are people who just viscerally dislike one another. But when the music starts, they immediately start cooperating. They're not trying to sabotage one another, which is kind of what we do now, right? If someone I dislike, I'm going to try and sabotage you, right? We pay people to do that. And that's why I love working with orchestras, because the collaboration and just the working together, I feel like there's something spiritual about doing that well. And so we're going to offer that chance to the audience as well.
And it sounds like it'll be a really interesting experience. It sounds like it'll be an uplifting experience. It sounds like it'll be a stimulating and exciting experience. So, April 20th, 7 o'clock, Twitchell Auditorium. Looking forward to seeing all of you there. And John, I'll of course be looking forward to seeing you too.
See you there.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks.